Sometimes when you pick a fresh book to read, you've already had your night coffee and you have skipped through the introduction of that book and you're finally on to that very first page of the first chapter. The very first lines intrigue you, and when you read through it, it constantly captivates you, line after line, and in that moment you know that you are in for a treat because this book is going to be great. Such is the impact of the very first line of the book, because no matter how much you read the same book over and over again, it is the very first few lines that stick with you forever. I personally try to remember a lot of best lines of the book because that is how I associate the feeling of reading that book when I first started it. Hello, I'm Karthik and you're listening to Growing Up Gone Wrong. This is a brand new episode of the podcast, and in this one, we are going to talk about the best first lines of books. I'm going to name some of the lines that I personally appreciate, the very first lines of the book, which have stayed with me for this long, and I hope they continue staying in my head so that I can recite them effortlessly. There is something about reciting quotes effortlessly, right? It just makes you feel so superior in some sense. I could be wrong, but yeah. So it was a few years back when I finally started reading in depth. I started reading books a lot more often, and I always was looking for a way to memorize all of the good things about a book. But it is practically not possible for people to remember all of the books they read. They have to come back to it over and over again to truly understand and keep that essence alive in themselves. So a way that I found or invented, I'm not sure invented, but I found was to note down the first lines of the book. It will keep nourishing that memory of how you felt when you finally finished that book and reminisced back to the very first page. So it holds memories. The very first lines of the book, they hold memories. And as Albert Camus said, that ending of a book is hidden inside the initial few pages of the book. So I am quite intrigued by the concept of paying attention to the very first pages and chapters and paragraphs. So it quite amazes me. So let us begin, and I will one by one iterate through the list that I have, and I will try to cover as long as possible. So the first one this is a very interesting one because the narrator is quite different than usual narrators, but I'll speak it up for you. First the colors, then the humans. That is how I see things. This is from the book Thief by Markus Zusak, and the narrator in this book is Death. So you really understand the point of view of Death, like how death perceives the world, what death exactly does. And it does not necessarily points any negative thoughts towards death, but instead a positive feedback. In this book, Death is narrating a story of a little girl whom he had encountered a couple of times, not directly. She was not in life or death situation, but people around her were dying and death was about to pick them up, and he used to witness and experience how that little girl was behaving or how she felt, and even death was moved by it. And the story is quite different than what I'm trying to say right now, but the narration is quite exquisite. Every single book that I read, it is either the main protagonist or antagonist from whose narration we hear the story, but from the point of view of death, which is universal, the story seems quite different and intriguing instantly. The very first line, first the colors, then the humans. That is how I see things. It's just quite amazing because the first few chapters, as I recall, were about colors. Death was narrating how white the scenery was and how red the experience that he was feeling with, because the moment he tried to pick people from their graves, the moment people died in war, it all felt red to him, or them actually. So the three colors that Death used in that very first chapter were red, white, and black. And all of those symbolized something too deep, and it just constantly stays with me forever now. And every time I mention, have a book on your shelf, and very feel-good book, but at the same time it is also nourishing you with information about how death feels when he is trying to pick people up to the earth. It is an amazing book, and I think I have recommended this book twice or thrice already in this podcast, so you should all really read this. So the next one is, this is like one of the first book that I read in 2021, and I had recently started reading back again after a gap of a year. It goes like, when I was born, the name for what I was did not exist. That really shook me for a while, because how sad is that? How sad it is to be unknown at the time of your birth, to be born something so different that there is no name for you. And I think that is the pure theme of this book as well. This book is called Circe by Madeline Miller, the same author who wrote The Song of Achilles, if you are familiar with it. But yeah, the whole theme of this book is practically the same from the very first line. I expected loneliness, and I did get loneliness. I expected a lot of struggle to be known in the world and yet somehow failing to be. I expected that. I really pictured a scene where the main protagonist, would be abandoned or left alone, and they would thrive alone in this world, and nobody would be there for them. And it is exactly how it went, and it was so beautifully narrated. So the very first line did actually contain the whole meaning and essence of the book. So this is 2 in 2, and I was really impressed by how this applies to almost every single book if you pay attention closely. The next one we got is All Happy Families Are Alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So this book, I'm not sure if you are aware of the book, but you might have heard of this before. This is from Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. And this concept by Tolstoy suggests that achieving happiness requires a significant formula. Like, it is constant, like people find happiness in beautiful little things, and there is the same ideology behind happiness. It requires almost the convergence of factors, almost like a formula as I already mentioned. But on the other hand, happiness is like a tree. It has multiple little branches and roots, and it can take any form, and it can stem unhappiness from various different reasons, creating a diverse array of situations and experiences that one can feel. And this specific quote also underscores that how complex and unique is the art of suffering. Like, everybody suffers in some unique way, no matter how much you relate to someone. Deep down, they are suffering in something different way. It is totally different than what you are expecting. And it's until they open up to you, you never know. You might feel their sadness because you also are suffering and you are also going through something, but in the end, it's totally different. And yes, once again, this book did not disappoint. It was a totally dramatic book, and a lot of different characters were converging all at once, and it was a slow read, I must admit, but in the end, the true dialogue of happiness and unhappiness in between families and lovers, and more drama was created in this book totally, because Tolstoy is a genius. He builds these characters in such a way that you live inside of them. You become the character, and when the character is suffering, you realize the uniqueness of suffering, while highlighting the more informed nature of contempt. I would highly recommend reading Anna Karenina. It is a long book, I must warn you. It is 1,000 pages at least. But if you are finding difficult to read hard books or like big books, there is also an episode that I recorded initially in this series of podcasts, how to read big books, especially Russian literature. You can check that out, and that might really help you. So moving on to the next one. Oh, this one is like one of the very favorite books of mine. It is totally beyond the niche of a lot of people, but the very first line that intrigued me about this book was, "The sea was slightly creased, as if a cloth had wrinkles in it." And the moment I started with this book, I knew that this is not just a story, this is a poetic dialogue. This is not just a prose, this is poem, all of the collective poems in different heads of mine, different personalities of mine, all at once, converted into a book. This book is called The Waves by Virginia Woolf, and I have just only read it once because it was too hard to read. Like, I had to reread the first few chapters twice and thrice to actually get the idea of narration, because this book conceptualizes the idea of a person having multiple personalities. Like, there are multiple voices in our head, and we're not just one people. We are complex and many. We're not simple and one. It really signifies that there are multiple voices and thoughts inside of us, which are sometimes on contradictory basis with each other. But this is crazy, like how there are a lot of voices in our head, and we somehow fighting battles within our own mind. And this book the first line did not really tell me about the story here. It revealed nothing, but it did set the tone of how I was supposed to pay attention in this book, because this was way too deep for my shallow mind to understand at that point. I was 19, I guess, and reading Virginia Woolf for the first time, it was totally mesmerizing. But when I finally got the hang of the narration, it went on really smoothly. In this book, there were actually no dialogues, there was no quotes, and there was no conversation. It was just voices in our head. There was no direct contact of narration. You did not point to anybody, there were no dialogues, and there were no quotes, and it was just voices in our head communicating with each other. And I explained it really badly. I butchered it, but I think you should really check out this book and you should read more about how and what ideas these kind of personifications and other poetic devices that symbolizes in this book. But yes, this is a must read if you are a classic literature fan and you are a poetic person as I am. So to the next one, this book I read a couple of months ago while I was traveling, and the very first line of this book is peak dystopian because it goes like, it was a pleasure to burn. It was a simple pleasure to see things eaten and get blackened. Like how so full of hate it is, because the actual meaning of this quote does not really imply to how the story goes, but still it is a really catching phrase to get someone to hook inside the book, right? And I kept on reading and later on realized that this book is about books and how he liked burning books. Oh, I forgot to give you the name. It is called Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. In this book, in the bleak future, the government bans all the books because it somehow creates more trouble than good for people. It is making people aware and people are questioning the government and the world is in chaos. So they just ban the books. And the biggest irony in this book is the firemen who were in this world actually, at least, are there to protect people from fire. They are to put out fires and, do all of that stuff, like the superhero stuff. But in that world, the houses are fireproof, so there is no chance of fire. And the firemen are actually given the task of burning the books. In any house where the books were found, the house was burned down. Since the house was fireproof, nothing happened to the house, but the books got burned. It is a quite bleak future, and I was really tense to actually imagine that what if I ever lived in that kind of a world. I mean, you should also think about it. What if there was a world where the books were illegal and like drugs, and you had to steal them and you have to keep them in your secret safe locker, and anybody ever found out, they might even kill you, or they might even sentence you to 15 years in prison. How scary and crazy is that, right? But it was really a good read, and the narrator, or I must say the protagonist, really gained his consciousness towards the end of the book, and he started reciting the book by heart. He started learning and cramming the book, because even if though the book was burned, it was still in his head and they could all recreate it. So I really love that concept, and the very first line set the tone for it, because I'm pretty sure if the story began like once upon a time or shit, I would never have read it. Come on. Who still writes like that? But this was really intriguing and captivated my attention instantly when I picked that book. So this next one, I think a lot of people would have read this one because it went quite famous, and a friend of mine gifted me 3 years ago. And the quote goes like, "He that has eyes to see and ears to hear may convince himself that no mortal can keep a secret." I should repeat, I think. He that has eyes to see and ears to hear may convince himself that no mortal can keep a secret. This is initially from Sigmund Freud's biography, but this was also used in this book, and this is how the book began. Since it was Sigmund Freud, I was instantly captivated again, and it had all of my attention in a single moment. What this quote actually means is that, I forgot to tell you the book. It is called The Silent Patient. And what really this quote means is that if someone pays real close attention to people's behavior or words or facial expressions, that person really has nothing to hide. Like, it is quite visible on their faces, on their expressions, on their behavior around other people. So they're not precisely keeping a secret. And people who really pay close observation and close attention to everything around them, nothing can be truly hidden from them, right? So in their head, they think that no secret can be kept from them, no matter how many efforts a person make, or no matter if the person is dumb enough to speak or they cannot speak at all. But if they cannot speak, their eyes will tell the secret. It really oozes out of them. That is how that person feels. So basically, being observant can make it seem like it's really, really hard for people to hide things. And I really agree with this, because sometimes we just assume that words are the only way of communication, right? They are the primary way of communication, but not sole way of communication. For example, if someone is sad, and we can really see it through their eyes and they do not tell anybody. And even though we do not really see it through their eyes, we just feel it. There is this gut-wrenching feeling that the person sitting next to you is not really feeling whole. That is a form of communication, and that is how observant your soul and your body is. And sometimes it just don't need any words or any form of communication to let you know that secret or specific thing that they were trying to hide from you. And I've also personally observed that while humans may attempt to conceal information, the nuances of human behavior are actually in a way that they end up revealing more than they actually try to hide. Indirect communication, like just I already mentioned, your behavior around people, your physical appearance, and your sense of dressing and your facial expressions tell a lot indirectly. And you are all that person needs is another active and observant person to be around them to notice all of that. It is truly how it feels to be seen. I really love Sigmund Freud's biography. Like, I started reading that book. I have an edition of his biography from 1943. It is a hardbound, and the pages are all quite thick. They are actually made of strings strings and thread rather than just paper. So I have a very lovely edition of that, and I really love reading from that book. But a lot of things just go way above my head because Freud was insane, and a lot of his things quite make sense but also are contradictory and controversial. It is a good read, I must say. Like, if you are too much into psychology and psychosis behind how the human brain works and how observant we are to people and things around us, I think it is a really good way to start. So we can do one more, and I think that should be it. But so this one is, I think a lot of people are already aware of this, and I picked a lot of the books that the audience might relate to already. I did not want to pick random strange ass books and which nobody has ever heard of. So this one is My Father Was a King and a Son of Kings. Do you want to take a guess? This is from The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I think I have talked about this book quite a lot of times in this podcast. Again, I remember the very first episode of this podcast, me and Geeta were having a conversation about this very single thing, how Patroclus made all of the audience, all of the readers fall in love with Achilles, and somehow the book is about Achilles and not Patroclus. That is the quite sad part of it. But I really love this book, how a fictional character holds power over me to fall in love with someone else, which is also a fictional character, and to feel sympathetic towards them and to actually indulge myself in the story a lot more than usual. So I think it is quite extraordinary how this book started, even because it was a little deceptive for me, because I really thought the very first line, which was the father was a king and a son of kings. So I really thought it would be more about strength and physical strength, to be precise, and a lot of fighting and a lot of anger. But in the end, it was really soft, and it was really more about catching on to your emotions and making the reader fall in love with someone you love. That is the best thing you could do, I think. So I was really shocked towards the end of the book how it ended and how it all went. But it did set the tone for me, because imagine somebody tells you a story about kings and their sons and who lived for war, and the war changed it completely, and you were reading about all of those mythological things, and the very first line, if it implies to you about kings and queens and princesses, and you would obviously be intrigued by the fantasy of it if you are into that genre. But that is what intrigued me a lot, and I'm so glad I picked that book, even though I knew the story of Troy a lot before because I have read the Iliad and the Odyssey. The point of view changed. The narration, as I already mentioned, is quite important, because the only thing that makes the book Thief one of the favorites of mine is the narration. The narration by Death is quite unique and different idea. In a similar way, I have read and saw the movie as well of the story of Troy from different various angles, from the perspective of Achilles and from the perspective of, let's say, the Trojans or the Athenians. But in the end, to see it through Patroclus is quite amazing. And I think there is another book on this exact story from the point of view of Women of Troy. I think the title of the book is Women of Troy. So I think I might end up getting my hands on that book and read that one too, because to read and to understand the story from all different point of views is how you truly grow as an individual, as a reader. And I tend to do that this year, or just to say next year, because this is almost done and dusted. So this was all I had today. I curated this all of myself, and if you are intrigued by the same kind of things that I am and you want me to create another episode around the first best lines of the book, I would really love to do that. Just so leave a message in the comments or the Q&A question that you would love to get another episode on the exact same topic but different books and maybe of different genres. I can come up with that, and yeah. So this is Once again, I'm going to say goodbye to you, only to come back later in the next episode. But it really felt good to record this episode because I had not recorded one in a week, and I really felt something was missing from my daily routine, but this fills it up. I've been getting really good comments and reviews on my podcast, so I'm really appreciative of all of the audiences. And I will see you in the next episode. Till then, take care and sleep well. I hope you really have a nice time. Goodbye.